Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Good evening.
Good evening.
I'm Dr. John Spencer, the Interim Director of the Tuohy Chair of Interreligious Studies. I want to welcome you to this lecture and to the university this evening. I will be your host for this evening's events. For those of you who were here last week, I welcome you back. For those who are here for the first time, I think you're in for a treat. This lecture series, Jerusalem, Jesus, and Jihad, End-Time Scenarios in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, is this year's edition of the Walter and Mary Tuohy Lectures in Interreligious Studies. These lectures are supported by a fund provided by Walter and Mary Tuohy. Mr. Tuohy was an officer of the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad, and his interest in interreligious studies led him and his wife to establish this endowed chair in 1966. That makes it one of the earliest chairs in the United States in interreligious studies. We here at John Carroll are both grateful for Walter and Mary Tuohy for their generosity and very privileged to carry on the practice of this engagement of different religious traditions. Our lecturer for tonight and for the next 4 weeks is Dr. David Barr. He is Professor of Religion at Wright State University. Dr. Barr received his PhD from Florida State University and has taught at Florida A&M University, University of Northern Iowa, and Wright State University, where he has spent most of his career. He has published 8 books, authored more than 35 articles and over 25 reviews, delivered dozens of lectures at scholarly meetings. All of this is by way of saying we have a well-qualified scholar to speak to us this evening. Last week, Dr. Barr set the stage for his religious studies approach to the issue of end times. He introduced us to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, their various subgroups, and perspectives on end times that these groups have. Tonight, he will continue that series, looking at where this idea of end times got its start. The lecture this evening is titled The Original End Times, Enoch, Daniel, Ezra, John. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Barr.
Thank you, John. I was remiss last week not to thank the university for their generosity in bringing me here, and especially Dr. John Day for his efforts in making all this possible. I also want to thank the Department of Religion for their generosity and for providing me the support and free time necessary to prepare decent lectures, at least what could be decent lectures, and especially to Dr. Sheila McGinn, who actively sought out my needs. I also need to thank Dr. John Spencer, who first approached me about this crazy idea and who has been extraordinarily supportive in carrying it out. I need to thank Catherine Merhar for her skills in negotiating the bureaucracies around here, her attendance to details, her finding resources, all of which skills leave me in awe. And finally, I want to thank the faculty and staff at the lunch table who provide both good cheer and occasionally something worth thinking about. Now, there's a slightly new title for the lecture tonight, because the old title proved to be too long, and I learned last week that I might speak just a tad too long, maybe 2 tads. In any case, I've condensed a little bit and left out a little bit, but I think the essence of what I want to talk about will be clear. Officially, at least, over half the world's population believes in the end times. Muslims and Christians and Jews together make up over half of the population, and officially, all of them believe that we approach the end times. Jews have traditionally believed in the coming of a Messiah who will redeem Israel and establish justice on earth. Some believe in the coming of a messianic age rather than a coming Messiah, but all of them are future-oriented in that way. Christians traditionally believe in the return of Jesus, called the Second Coming, when he will come back and fight the evil in the world at the famous Battle of Armageddon, after which he will judge humankind for their foibles and successes. Muslims also believe in the second coming of Jesus and his victory over evil in some ultimate battle. They also believe in the return of the Mahdi, who will either join Jesus in ridding the world of evil or replace him in doing so. Polls indicate that these are active beliefs for a majority in each tradition, but with some ambiguity. We went over some of these statistics last time. Just to summarize here, there's a difference between believing in the end times and living in the end times. That is, believing in them is easy to do. Living as if it is actually the end times is something more difficult. Polls indicate that probably between 20 and 30% of Christians and Jews, and maybe as many as 50% of Muslims, are convinced that the end times are working out in our own lifetime. This is what I referred to last week as a functional belief. That is, beliefs that actually influence the behavior of believers. For example, when James Watt was Secretary of the Interior, he was opening the national forest for drilling, and he was asked if he didn't wish to preserve them for his grandchildren. His reply, as reported in the Chicago Tribune, was there was no need to do that since Jesus would return before his grandchildren needed them. Now, I suggested last week that end times thinking is more likely to be functional for Orthodox Jews, Protestant Christians, and Shia Muslims, though it extends across the spectrum in each case. It's most likely to be functional for what I'm calling the anti-modernist factions in each tradition, the ultra-Orthodox Jews, the evangelical Christians, and the Salafi Muslims. These observations raise a few basic questions that stand behind the lecture I'm giving tonight, and which I want to return to at the end to actually try to discuss. That is, why is it that the monotheistic traditions, and only the monotheistic traditions, construct elaborate scenarios of the end times? And why do these factions, these particular factions, embrace these scenarios most enthusiastically? Now, there are several ways one could go about trying to answer such questions. As a religion scholar and not a theologian, I try to focus on the level of actual lived experience of the believer rather than on abstract ideas. My goal is to understand the meaning, the implications of such beliefs, rather than to assess their truth, though I will do some assessing a little bit later. So I turn first to history, which I'm going to organize by looking at 3 highly symbolic days. It is my conviction that the events symbolized by these days conspire to threaten the basic paradigm of monotheism, namely that God is in control of history, or in control of everything else for that matter. The notion that God is in control is fundamental, and I want to probe it back as far as I can, and I think we can see its roots in the proto-monotheistic tradition known as the Decalogue, or the 10 Commandments. They begin with the declaration that God has done something on behalf of his people, and now he expects something in return. That is, there is an implicit therefore between the 2 clauses of the sentence. I have done X, now you must do Y. This is the language of treaty or covenant, with duties assigned to each partner. One of the partners has already acted on behalf of the other, and now the people must honor this God and obey his rules. And when they do, good things will happen. As one writer has God declare, if you follow my statutes and keep my commandments and observe them faithfully, I will grant you your rains in their seasons, and the land shall yield its produce, and I will grant peace, shalom, in the land. Deuteronomy 22, 2-4. But there's also a darker side to this idyllic promise. Failure to keep the rules could result in disaster. In the same chapter of Deuteronomy, but if you do not obey and do not observe all these commandments, I will bring terror on you. You will sow your seed in vain. Your enemies shall eat it. I will set my face against you. You shall be struck down by your enemies. So the paradigm of the covenant is a paradigm of 2 paths. Obedience will produce prosperity, and disobedience will produce disaster. Now, this is not an uncommon pattern, nor is it unique to the monotheistic traditions. Gods are fussy this way. They want to be obeyed, and they expect to provide certain things for their devotees, sort of like parents. There's no need for an end time in such a scenario. But a new paradigm was created in 3 days. And I want you to understand I use the 3 days as symbolically as the author of Genesis did. 3 historical events, first enhanced, then stretched, and finally broke the 2 paths paradigm, replacing it with something quite different. So day 1, enhancing the 2-part paradigm. The day is March 16, 597 BCE. Jerusalem, where it was believed God sat invisibly enthroned in his temple, fell to the Babylonians, and the king and his court were carried off into exile. Now, this was a disaster of unimaginable proportions. Every aspect of Israel's social life was called into question or removed. The king was gone. The land was no longer theirs. The temple was destroyed. History had betrayed them. The covenant apparently has been broken. Now, gods were expected to look out for their people. And if they could not look out for them, what did that say about their powers? Consider the taunt of an earlier would-be conqueror. The claim that Yahweh, like all the gods of the other nations, will be powerless before the mighty military machine of Assyria. Who among all the gods of the countries have delivered their countries out of my hand, that Yahweh should deliver Jerusalem out of my hand? This notion that political contest and military conquest are evidence of divine powers is pervasive in the ancient world. But what the Assyrians had only threatened, the Babylonians had accomplished. Jerusalem did fall. The king, the city, the temple, the land are all gone. How could God do such a thing? Now, it's no small testament to the literary powers of the scribes working during the exile that this disaster actually strengthened the historical paradigm of the two paths. They rewrote the history of Israel from the time of the judges to their own time, continually emphasizing Israel's failure. Like the striking of a bell, the motif is repeated again and again. The king did that which was evil in the sight of Yahweh. Since the basic theme of the book of Deuteronomy is do good and prosper, do bad and fail, this history has become known as the Deuteronomic history. It worked. They preserved and indeed strengthened the idea that God was still in control of history. Their suffering made sense. And that's always the thing about suffering. Can you make sense out of it? One can endure any amount of suffering if you know the cause, if you know the reason, if you're doing it for a cause. It's the matter of making sense that is the difficulty. Now, this idea that bad things happen to bad people is an old and powerful explanation, one that still maintains its force in our own time, as all of you have no doubt experienced it sometime in your life when Grandma told you what was going to happen if you kept doing that. The Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard once wrote what I would think would be an entertaining sermon called "On Comfort in the Thought that Before God we are always in the wrong." The comfort is that no matter what bad thing happens to you, you know you deserved it. Now, most of the prophets echoed this same model. That is how they could predict the future. They knew Israel had a covenant with Yahweh. They knew Israel was not keeping her terms of the covenant. They could therefore predict what was going to happen as a result of that. Their primary intention is not to predict the future, but to reinforce the keeping of the covenant. Now, the Judeans would eventually return from the exile, but they would never again be a political force. They would never again have a king. They would henceforth be a vassal state. Even the prophets ceased their prophesying. Surely this subordinate condition was not God's ultimate plan. After all, the king was supposed to be God's son, to rule in God's place, Psalm 2 and Psalm 76. This is the beginning of messianic longings. But fast forward now to day 2, stretching the two-path paradigm. The date I've chosen there is June 1, 323 BC. Though no one noticed at the time, the world was forever changed. It was the day Alexander the Great fell ill and soon died on his journey back to Macedonia, having conquered the territory from Macedonia to the Indus River in India. And here, I just couldn't resist stumbling over the wire. I just couldn't resist. We have the screen set up so I can see it, but it won't come to, there it is. I found something that I thought was extremely clever. What we have here is a diagram of, that is a map, has the route that they followed and the years of Alexander's march. And if I press this button, these are the battles that he fought along the way. Notice how the years are adding up as they march further and further to the east, till finally his troops say, "Alex, it's time to go home." They turned around, and of course, they were a long ways from home. They eventually arrive back at Babylon, where Alexander falls ill. Tradition has a malaria possibility. Syphilis is part of the anti-Alexander tradition. And the other possibility is that he was poisoned. I personally favor the swamp fever, but one can't say for certain. So there was, with Alexander dead, his generals proceeded to carve up his empire into 4 other empires, and they're represented here in this map. The awkward thing, of course, is that these are not fixed boundaries. They're going to fight back and forth between each kingdom. And for Israel, which exists here along the coast of the Mediterranean, between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, which will constantly fight back and forth with troops marching through Israel one way and marching back the other way, being a thoroughly uncomfortable place to live. One page at a time. But whichever master they served, whether the Ptolemies or the Seleucids, whichever master they served a Greek master. Greek culture, Greek education, Greek language, Greek customs prevailed everywhere, including Judea. A great deal of assimilation occurred, a process called Hellenization. It's called Hellenization because the Greeks' name for their own country was Hellas, not Greece. It's just that when the Romans first met them, they misnamed them and said, see the Greeks. It's sort of like Columbus landing in America and thinking he was an Indian and say, look at the Indians. And we've been calling them Indians ever since, although we're pretty sure now this is not India. Same thing happened to the Greeks, but the degree of Hellenization among the Jews, especially the merchant class and the upper class, is truly remarkable, surprising even. By 200 BCE, many of the leading citizens looked like, talked like, behaved like Greeks. And you know what they say about ducks. They established a gymnasium, the basic Greek educational institution in Jerusalem, and some even had become citizens of Antioch, both of which would have involved recognition of the Greek gods. Now, the history of this period is recounted in a book called 1 Maccabees, which indicates that some went so far as to undergo a surgery to, quote, remove the marks of circumcision. It's not a surgery I like to contemplate. But Greek education involved extensive physical training, and it was done outdoors, and it was done in the nude. I don't have a picture. But boys, as you may know, notice such things. And it seemed advisable for some of the upper class men to appear more Greek. Then, for reasons that are still mysterious to us, the Seleucid ruler Antiochus IV decided to hasten the Hellenization of the empire by requiring that all people everywhere worship the Greek gods. Which brings us to day 3, the two-path paradigm broken. December 15, 168 BCE. The unthinkable had happened. Antiochus launched a campaign to force all Judeans to adopt Greek religion. And we can only speculate as to his motives. Perhaps it was just the fact that he was a megalomaniac. He did, after all, take the throne name Antiochus IV Epiphanes, which means something like Antiochus, a manifestation of God. Perhaps it was geopolitical. He was on the verge of conquering Egypt when Rome intervened and stopped him. Perhaps it was personal. It said that when he returned from his Egyptian campaign, he found them celebrating in Jerusalem because they had heard he had died in battle. Whatever the reason, Antiochus instituted a series of draconian measures. He forbade the keeping of the Sabbath. He forbade circumcision. He ordered copies of the Torah to be destroyed. He set up the image of Zeus and sacrificed the pig. And then he sent troops throughout the villages to enforce the village elders to offer sacrifices to the Greek gods. Needless to say, all hell broke loose. That is, as recounted in the book called 1 Maccabees, we read the fascinating story that I don't have time to tell you, but I can offer a brief summary. A small band of true believers fights against an evil empire and its hordes of mercenary fighters, and against ever greater odds, eventually prevail. Rather than recount the battles, I want to explore how people responded to the fundamental question: why such suffering occurs in the first place? How is it that good people suffer? Some attempted to maintain the old explanation. God was punishing them for their sins. And as Kierkegaard noted, there's a certain universal validity to such an idea. But there was a problem. It wasn't the wicked people who were suffering. Those willing to cooperate with Antiochus got along very well. It's only those who tried to remain faithful to the law, to keep the covenant with Yahweh, who suffered. And how do you explain that? Now, the prophet Habakkuk had already complained of how God could use a nation more sinful than Israel to punish Israel. And Job wrestled long and hard with the question of righteous suffering without ever finding a satisfactory answer. But what if what was happening in the present moment was not ordinary suffering in ordinary times, but extraordinary suffering in extraordinary times? The new answer that emerged is very nearly the opposite of Deuteronomic thinking. The righteous are suffering not for what they have done, but for circumstances beyond their control. They live in the end times. And those times are qualitatively different from ordinary times. Scholars have come to call this new way of thinking apocalyptic, or more accurately, apocalypticism. I'm going to continue to refer to it as end times thinking as just a simpler convention. Such thinking involves the construction of a new story. The problem is most clearly articulated in a work called For Ezra, in which the author lays out quite clearly the complaint that, after all, isn't Israel supposed to be God's people? Isn't the world supposed to be made for them? Why do we not possess the world? Something has gone wrong. Evil people prosper, and good people are suffering. So we turn now from history to literature to see how a couple of writers dealt with these issues. The first is called the book of Daniel. It was written during the crisis. We can see in the book that the author knows about the desolation of the temple, the setting up of the image of Zeus, but he does not know how the situation would resolve itself within the next 3 years. It's a curious book. The first part, chapters 1 through 6, are stories about the hero Daniel, who lived in Babylon during the exile, and how he remained faithful to his Jewish ways and did not succumb to pagan ways. The latter part, chapters 7 through 12, consists of dreams that this Daniel is said to have had, along with interpretations of the dreams. Now, because it pretends to be written by Daniel, who lived in 500, but is actually being written in 200, it's able to predict the course of events from Daniel's time to his own time with remarkable accuracy. A device called prophecy ex eventu, or prediction after the event. This has the double effect of showing that all history is under God's control, and that all past events lead up to the present moment. Thus, the present suffering is a time of significance. It is a good thing that we are suffering, for it shows that the final time draws near. In fact, the very existence of the book of Daniel proves that the end times have arrived, because Daniel was instructed to seal up this book and keep it hidden until the time of the end. The very fact that you can now read it must mean that the time of the end has come, because it has been unsealed. The presence of ever greater wickedness in the world, far from being a sign that God is not in control, might actually be a sign that God is about to act to bring about a new world. In fact, the author of Daniel tries to predict when the end will actually come. He does this first by mentioning a sequence of events in which Antiochus would return to Judea, lay siege to Jerusalem, only to die in the attack. The trouble is, Antiochus died in another war in Asia Minor and never got back to Israel. That's why we know it wasn't written after 165. Daniel also tries to predict the end in terms of a set period of time. He is, as far as I know, the first author to try to name a specific date when the end would come. Sadly, not the last. At first he declares, from the time of the regular burnt offering is taken away, that's the incident in the temple, and the abomination that makes desolate is set up, there shall be 1,290 days. And then he seems to recalculate. Happy are those who persevere and attain the 1,395 days. It seems clear that Daniel was written sometime between the desecration of the temple and the death of Antiochus, 168 and 164, and the latter prediction does not happen. The failure of all three time-setting devices does not seem to have lessened the value of his work for its early readers. Not the last time that failure to predict the end did not seem to have any effect on a movement's success. For Daniel has achieved something greater than the actual prediction of the end. He achieved what John Collins calls a transformation of the imagination. The small screen drama of how law-observant Jews fought against Antiochus is cast onto the cosmic screen as a battle between Michael, the prince of God's people, and an unnamed prince of Persia. In chapter 10, Daniel reports a dream visit from an angel who hadn't been able to get to him before, though Daniel had been praying for 3 weeks for some understanding. He says, God has heard your words, and I have come because of your words. But the prince of the kingdom of Persia opposed me for 21 days. So Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, and I left him there with the prince of the kingdom of Persia, and have come to help you understand what is to happen to your people at the end of days. This is not yet a battle with the devil, but we will, as we will discuss next week, it's a step in that direction. In this way, Daniel manages to explain suffering without blaming either God for God's seeming absence or blaming the people for their sinfulness. Rather, something has gone wrong with the world. As the messenger tells Daniel, I've come to help you understand what is to happen at the end of days. And Daniel imagines that the world will be purified through a war when the old rivalry between the Ptolemaic Egypt and the Seleucid Syria will be resolved through direct divine intervention. He talks about the king of the south waging war against the king of the north, and suddenly, without warning, the king of the north will be destroyed. Now, this notion of holy war, righteous violence, is another theme that we must take up, but will not include tonight. Now, Daniel concludes his vision with elements that will persist in the stories of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The appearance of a heavenly deliverer, in Daniel's case it's the angel Michael, the deliverance of God's people, and a time of final judgment, including the resurrection of the dead. That's Daniel 12, 1 through 4. Daniel represents the response to the crisis of Hellenization during the time of crisis, when Hellenization has become the enemy. But some had seen the problem coming. Several decades before Daniel, an anonymous writer constructed an extraordinary retelling of the flood story involving lustful angels and clashes of culture. The story is called The Book of the Watchers. It's found in a collection of anonymous writings known as 1 Enoch. So First Enoch consists of several such writings, all sharing the common fiction that they were written by Enoch, who was, in case you're a little weak on your genealogies, the grandfather of Noah and the 7th generation from Adam. Enoch writes to explain the coming end of the world in the Great Flood. That Enoch would write such a narrative is, of course, impossible, but Enoch was a tempting channel for revelation, since the biblical text says very little about him, but it does include this poignant phrase, Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. That is, anybody that used to go for walks with God surely must have learned a thing or two, and perhaps we can channel that. In reality, the earliest writings in 1 Enoch was written around 200 BCE, just a few decades before the time of Antiochus. It's called the Book of the Watchers. The Watchers refer to those angels who were assigned guardianship of the creation to look after the human race, to watch over them. It is built on the fragment of a myth found in Genesis chapter 6. How did I get back to there? You have seen these slides, right? We got to a new one? Good. It's a strange story, to be sure. It talks about these angels who were looking after humans, got intrigued by human women, and decided to marry them. And when they did, giants were born to them, and they are the warriors of old of renown. It's clearly a fragmented myth, but our writer had noticed that the next verse begins talking about the flood, and saw in this the way to construct a new story of the end. He begins by having Enoch explain that he writes not for his own time, but for one that is distant. That is, for the time of the actual author. There follows immediately a divine manifestation in which God comes from his holy mountain to execute judgment on all and to destroy the wicked. 1:9. This divine action will once again set the world aright. Quote, for the chosen there will be light and joy and peace. They will inherit the earth. But for the wicked there will be a curse. I see what I'm doing. I'm pressing this little button. quit pressing buttons. In Enoch, in the Book of the Watchers, the scene suddenly shifts to where the angels are debating whether they should take wives of the, quote, comely daughters born to men. Their chief, called in one version of the story Samaiyas, in another version Asael or Azazel, eventually wins the argument and entices 200 of the watchers to take this path. These fallen watchers now lead the humans into various sins, not only in illicit intercourse, but also teaching, quote, charms and spells, the cuttings of roots and trees, how to make swords, daggers, and shields and breastplates, the art of makeup, making bracelets, ornaments, and colored dyes, and the art of astrology. The story finally declares, and the world was changed. There was great impiety and much fornication. It's still human wickedness that leads to judgment, but in this version of the story, it is not entirely their fault. For the righteous are led astray by those who should be watching over them. The watchers are wanton, though highly skilled and possessing advanced science. They represent a more seductive culture with more captivating women. Mere mortals have no chance of standing against these opponents. Now, on some level, this represents a highly symbolic description of the Judean political situation under Alexander's heirs. And the sins enumerated, making of armaments and pharmacology, astrology, and makeup, are likely the sins of the Hellenized upper class. Like the heavenly appointed watchers, the present rulers did not fulfill their role of watching over their charges. Like Alexander, they have brought about a changed world and faced divine judgment. The story continues that things are so bad that it cannot be fixed, but must have a new beginning. So God sends Sariel to Noah. Go to Noah and say in my name, hide yourself and reveal to him that the end is coming, the whole earth shall perish. Now 3 other angels are sent in divine missions. Raphael is sent to bind Asael, cast him into outer darkness. Gabriel is commissioned to destroy the giants, and Michael is commissioned to imprison Shemaiah, and then to destroy all perversity from the face of the earth. The work concludes with a lengthy section in which Enoch is sent to the watchers to inform them of their fates, during which he recounts the marvelous things he has seen on his journey through the universe, ironically displaying his own Hellenistic learning. We have then a creative reworking of a biblical narrative, radically transforming its meaning and applying it to the new situation of Hellenization. By attributing the work to Enoch and connecting it to the flood story, the author is able to establish a biblical precedent for cosmic judgment of the present evil age, to suggest divine foreknowledge of the near end of the world and point to a time of catastrophic remedy for the present evil. These 3 ideas are essential to the development of end times thinking. All he did was move it a little bit. I just need to take a vacation every now and then. So one answer to the question of why good people suffer is the failure of leaders. The watchers have been seduced by the Hellenistic culture, and the world has been so polluted that it must be destroyed. The suffering of the righteous is a sign of the end times. It's not their fault, for good people must expect to suffer in such a world. There's a hint that the powerful but evil supernatural persons are present at work, the shadow at least of the devil. Now Enoch remained a popular writing for centuries, and one New Testament author, Jude, even cites it as if it were scripture, but it was never accepted into the canon. In both these stories, we see the beginnings of a new conception of time, the time just before the end times. And I've tried to capture that in this chart here. Notice that there's not one age, but 2 ages, this age and the age to come. And between the 2 ages stands some kind of an act of divine intervention. And there, before the end, there's going to be this time of testing. So the very end, the end times is this part here. This is this age. This is the age to come. Those 2 ages are mirror images of each other. Everything you can say about one, the opposite will be true in the other. And we're approaching that end time, so that these people believe that they live not in ordinary times, but in a time that has the quality of being the end time. When things cannot possibly get any worse, God will intervene, usually by sending an army to destroy the wicked. Now this is all rather different from what you find in the classical prophets. For the prophets, the world is good, and good people will be rewarded. In the end times, the world has become evil, and good people should expect to suffer. For the prophets, we suffer for our own sins. In the end times, we suffer for the sins of the world. For the prophets, the ideal time is the past, and must be a renewal of faithfulness, such as characterized the beginnings. In the end times, the ideal time is the future, in fact, even a new world order. For the prophets, rewards and punishments occur in this life. In the end times, rewards will be deferred to the next life. And you can see here the need for thinking about an afterlife. Because if you're going to remain faithful, and that's going to lead to your death, there needs to be some calculation made here. If this life is all there is, then you have lost, as it were, everything possible. And so there begins to, the sense of justice calls forth an expectation that there must be something more, some afterlife in which rewards can be taken care of. Now, Daniel and Enoch are only a small part of the end times writings produced during this period, and the elements of end times thinking that I've been talking about are widely distributed. What we see in Daniel and the Book of the Watchers reflects a general cultural shift that will strongly affect nascent Judaism and Christianity, and eventually exert a strong influence on the birth of Islam. Each will adopt the notion of the present evil age, the nearness of the end, catastrophic judgment, all wrestling with the apparent contradiction between the actual history and the idea that God rules history. It's no accident that the end-time story are especially characteristic of the three monotheistic traditions. In fact, such thinking may be endemic to monotheism. That's a topic I wouldn't mind discussing with you a little later. For neither polytheism nor atheism face the dilemma of explaining why things go wrong in the world. Polytheists can always blame one of the other gods for whatever goes wrong, and atheists are not surprised that no one seems to be in charge. But monotheism requires that the world somehow work, that it be a just world, where good is rewarded and evil is punished, or at least that there should be a plan to get to such a world. What I'm calling end times angst stems from living in a world that is so patently not ruled by God, perhaps ruled by some evil force, as we'll look at next week. The most obvious way in which these paradigms have had an impact on Islam is the understanding of Muhammad as the final prophet, announcing the impending hour of judgment as arriving. The approaching end requires repentance and striving, both individual striving to live a better life and communal striving to establish Allah's will throughout the world. About this latter, David Cook writes, "More and more students of Islam are coming to realize that the energy and power required for the Muslim conquest was actually supplied by a belief in the imminent end of the world. Like Noah, Muhammad must work to get the ark built before the flood comes. The emphasis on individual repentance before the final hour means that there's the strongest possible connection between end times thinking and ethics in Islam. In addition, we have seen that political impotence before a dominating power makes the alternative end time story very attractive. For many Muslims today, the domination of the world by Western, especially American influence, is wrong. Politically, educationally, culturally, most of the world is adapting to Western ways. Through commerce, through international organizations, through entertainment, especially Hollywood movies. These are perceived as a direct threat to traditional Muslim ways of life. The friendly relationship between America and several oil-rich Muslim states, including the stationing of American troops in Saudi Arabia, is seen by more traditional systems to be adding insult to injury. Add to this the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, followed by the American wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and it's easy to see that the ground is right for rebirth of apocalyptic end times thinking in the Muslim world, especially the Shia world, though who are more inclined to such views to start with. Now, one would think the opposite would be true of Christians. After all, the Christians are the Western nations. But this is to overlook the important distinction between mainstream and evangelical Christianity. They too, evangelicals too, find Western culture to be in decline, threatened by certain advances in science in areas as divergent as biological evolution, reproductive technology, and global warming. Above all, control of government by rational and secular means is seen as a betrayal of the divine plan. The growing acceptance of gays and lesbians, the secularization of public education, the legalization of early-term abortions have elicited numerous apocalyptic scenarios, especially among the evangelicals. Judaism seems the least affected by end-time scenarios in the modern world, though not immune. Their temporal anxiety seems to be focused on the state of Israel itself, understood as a response to the devastation of the Nazi Holocaust. Ultra-Orthodox Jews have moved from the outright rejection of a secular state of Israel to a determined effort to transform it into a religious state. And many in all three traditions embrace the essential elements of end-time thinking. The time is near. In fact, there's a certain irony in the conception that the signs of the end times are severe natural disasters, cosmic upheavals, and social disruptions, all of which are predicted to increase as the end approaches. Thus the irony, the worse things are, the better off you are. A friend who calls it losing team eschatology. The further behind we are, the more likely we are to win. Now, at the risk of overreaching and an effort to prompt some discussion, let me suggest a couple of implications, both positive and negative, for the analysis of end times thinking that I've been trying to describe here. Perhaps the greatest benefit of end times thinking is that it eases the tension of living in a fallen world. It is able to explain how the world is as it is, and this is no small accomplishment. In addition, end times thinking could, under the right circumstances, as in early Islam, provide the motivation for trying to make the world a better place than it is. But at what price? What is wrong with end times thinking? I suggest two things. First, you have to wonder whether the offer is not expired. After all, it's been over 2,000 years since that first announcement that the end times have arrived. How long can you maintain end times without them becoming ordinary times? Second, such end times thinking interferes with rational decision-making on contemporary issues such as ecology and global security. Can we afford to tell ourselves such stories of the end times when we live in a global world and wish to embrace diversity? So I'm going to invite you to discuss these questions. We'll talk about some questions for next week. We'll include discussions of the devil. Is this going to, it's going to start working again, okay. I'm going to move up from behind the podium and invite you to make me as uncomfortable as possible. So, time for questions. Who wants to go first? I should plant one person. Yes?
It seems to me that the end times are every day, that it doesn't make any difference as long as we follow a code of decent living, respect for our other, for other human beings. And it's like, why does it even matter to even talk about end times? Because for all of us, it is the end time, sooner or later.
Yes, there are two kinds of end times. One is we can all expect, sooner for some of us than others. There is that end. But there's also this notion of a social end. End times thinking grows out of a very real problem. The world is not as it ought to be. I think everybody can agree on that. You look around, surely we can imagine a better world than the one we live in. How do you explain that? If there is a God, if that God is powerful, if that God intends to make a perfect world, how can the world be in such a mess? And end times thinking says, I can explain that because this age is under the control of evil powers and will soon end and something new will happen. What I hear you saying is, in your own life you have no need to think about the end times, and I think that's true of the majority of people in all three traditions. Certainly the majority in Judaism and Christianity believe in some general way in the end times, but it's not a functional belief in their system. Yes?
Professor, you are connecting the end times way of thinking with monotheism, but I'm wondering if instead of monotheism per se, if it would be perhaps another way to look at it would be to connect it with late Second Temple Jewish literature, which is so apocalyptic, and of course, as we all know, Christianity comes out of late Second Temple Judaism, and so it has that apocalyptic mentality to it. And I think what we see with Islam is some appropriation of those ideas that come out of Jewish and Christian scriptures, which are so influenced by the apocalypticism of the late Second Temple period. So I'm wondering if there might be more of a connection with the literature of the time rather than the idea of monotheism per se. Because the three monotheistic religions are so imbued, you might say, you could also even say informed in a sense by that literature.
My point is that that literature would not have emerged if they had not felt the need to explain the world that they live in. And that need springs, I think, from these historical events in which it becomes abundantly clear that the world is not only does not work according to the Deuteronomic model, but it works almost opposite of the Deuteronomic model. That the better off, the worse you are, the better off you are, and the better you live, the worse off you are. How do you explain that? And that leads to the birth of what you're calling apocalyptic literature, of which there are literally dozens of pieces. Daniel in the Book of the Watchers, just 2 instances, but they all share this common notion that somehow the end times have arrived, and that those end times will produce a wholly different world in the very near future. Every apocalyptic writing, end times writing, imagines that the end times are going to happen any day now, because without that, it doesn't work. And my suggestion at the end, well, it didn't work. Jerry?
You had a really provocative slide when you were talking about the classical prophets versus end times thinking. And one of the points you made was, we suffer for our own sins in the classical view. And then the slide actually said we suffer for the sins of the world. And that really hit me. And I'm wondering about connection between that thinking and deciding that, well, we can't really do that. We haven't got the capacity, but Christ can die for the sins of the world.
I think you're moving in a
connection between those.
I think you're moving in a fruitful direction. I think that much of the early Christian explanation of the world rested on this kind of end times thinking, and that the notion that good people suffer, and that that suffering can somehow ameliorate the situation of the world, bring about a new age, underlies the notion of Jesus' suffering for others. I think that's a fruitful area to move into. Not one I'm going to do, but you could. Sir?
But is it not like the carrot on the end of the stick? And as this woman here said, you know, we all realize there's an end to each one of us. And if we believe in an afterlife, that kingdom, that punishment will come at that time. And for the rest of those of us that don't die tonight, will still follow that carrot.
If there were no implications beyond our individual sensibilities, I'd be perfectly happy with that. As I said last week, I do not believe in end times or that there is any religious end to the world. But I live in a world with lots of people who do. And I'm eventually going to talk about some of the political implications for the contemporary world of those Jews, Christians, and Muslims who actually believe and act on the notion that the end times is right around the corner. Either that they can do something to bring it about, or they can see what God is doing and cooperate with that in the present world. So that it's not just a matter of belief, but a matter of what's actually happening in the world that we live in. Yes?
You kind of touched on a connection between the end times and a belief in reward after death.
Right?
Did one cause the other? Did they develop at the same time among the Jews?
Well, yes, several things emerge here in the same confluence. And I think the notion of life after death is very vague in ancient Israel. You don't find much talk about it in the prophets or the historical writings, some vague belief in the grave, going to Sheol, there's no heaven or hell, that sort of thing. But once you get to the place where you're suffering for good, you're suffering because you're doing good, that raises the question of divine justice. If God is just, how does that make sense? And it's coincidental, probably causational, that the notion that innocent suffering must be compensated for some way in the future, and if not in this life, then a projection into some future life. Understood in very vague and beginning ways during the period of Daniel. But he does talk about the resurrection of the dead who will come back and get their reward. If I don't answer your question and get sidetracked, feel free to come back and say, wait a minute. Yes?
I may have missed it, but did the Greeks approach that same problem of with people suffering with their religion?
No, it only emerges, I think, in monotheistic systems, because take Odysseus trying to find his way home. He's made an enemy of Poseidon, and he's just going to keep working against him. It's not that Poseidon is an evil god, just that Odysseus has pissed him off. And so if you got lots of gods and bad things happen to you, somebody is out to get you, but it's not necessarily an evil person. It's someone who you probably ought to try to get on the best side of. And so polytheistic traditions don't have this same problem that monotheistic traditions have. I think that's why we don't have an end-time scenario in Buddhism or Hinduism or Confucianism or Taoism. They do not conceive of the world as coming to an end in this fashion, as near as I can tell. I thought I saw a hand here, yes.
I'm not quite sure how to phrase this, but it seems to me that you have two possible trajectories with end-time thinking. One is, it's out of our hands, God's going to do it, so whatever we do doesn't really matter. And, you know, for example, we have a hurricane in New Orleans because God doesn't like gay people. You know, we can't do anything about it, that's God's punishment. But yet, I see, at least in contemporary society, and certainly at the time when Jesus was considered a Messiah who should overcome the government, that the people who are saying we can't do anything about it, it's the end times, God will fix it, are still trying to bring societal change, fighting against the ruler, getting rid of government, trying to put into place laws that reflect the belief system that they come from. That seems to me to be dichotomous.
You can skip lecture 6 if you want to. In fact, within each of these traditions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, you find that same dichotomy. And I'll be trying to put some flesh on those bones in week 6. Maybe we should confer before then. Yes?
Yeah, I would like to go back to the question of monotheism. What about the monotheism of early Roman imperial Stoic philosophy? It didn't have any kind of apocalyptic worldview, but it did have a notion of the divine as, that would be something parallel to monotheism. I'm struck by that.
More pantheism than monotheism, I think, than that Stoicism has the notion that whatever happens to you is good for you. And that is a different way of solving the problem. Stoicism is an absolutely fascinating response to these same kinds of issues that goes beyond polytheism and monotheism, but does wind up in kind of a universal order, which is, if not pantheism, at least kind of an animism of the world, I think. I'd be glad to talk about that more, but perhaps I would bore other people if I did, so I'll stop. And should I stop entirely? No.
One question about the chart you had with the present times, the times to come, the divine intervention in the middle. Is this a one-time event? This will never be repeated? I think the word was incorruptible in the times to come. Do they talk about the possibility of a future corruption or another decline and the cycle repeating?
No, they do not.
Okay.
They imagine this as a punctiliar event that will fix everything.
Okay. And Noah wasn't that event. The Great Flood wasn't that event.
Right. But provides a kind of paradigm See, one of the trouble with the Noah event is God promised never to do that again. And yet, here he's going to do it again. So they're a little shaky on the Noah event. I'll talk some more about that when I talk about the struggle. Yes?
What is your personal religion?
My personal religion, I was raised as a fundamentalist Christian, evolved into kind of a liberal Christian, and then finally into kind of a nominal Christian. So I'm very secular. I operate mostly by means of reason, and probably would be described by my students as a humanist if they would get around to thinking in such big terms. Do I practice? Do I go to church? Is that the question?
Yeah.
Not very often.
All right. Thank you.
I used to not tell my students what I believed because I was afraid I'd influence them, but I've learned it's much harder to influence people than I ever imagined. One more?
One more. Professor, I want to say to you, I totally agree with you and your concern about how end times thinking can influence people and influence them.
Can we just stop there when you say you entirely agree with me? Go ahead, go ahead.
Yeah. I'm a student of early Christianity and the New Testament. And one of the things that I was looking at in terms of my own research would be to study how end times thinking influenced the various Jewish factions in the late 60s of the first century, and how that ultimately led to their demise. Because they expected the end to come, and some factions wanted to do everything they could to make the end come. And they weren't really too wise about how they did that, and it ended up leading to the destruction of Jerusalem.
It's a hard thing to pin down. Paul, for example, clearly believed that the end times were extremely close. When he's writing to the Thessalonians, he said that when Jesus returns, the dead in Christ will be raised first, and then we who are alive and remain will be caught up together with the Lord. Not those who are alive, but we. That is Paul's assumption, is that he would be around for the end times. Perhaps this is a sign of the end. Any last questions, comments, witty remarks?
One last question.
I know that you're probably less interested in the theological aspect of this than I am. But how much longer do you think Christianity can sustain a belief in the return of Christ? It's been 2,000 years.
I see no abatement. I think another 2,000 years is possible. But I'm not a prophet nor the son of a prophet, as Amos might say. Called the son of something else occasionally, but not the prophet. So that will bring us to the end.
Let me join you in thanking Dr. Barr for his presentation.